I'm Kate Seeley with Vice President of the Middle East Institute. Thank you all so much for joining us for the third panel of the day. People are still making their way in from lunch, but we'll take advantage of this time to start the introductions. Today's conference, Game Changer Politics and Policy for a New Middle East, is exploring the implications of the Arab Spring for regional policies, as well as for U.S. policy in the region. And we're trying to wrap our heads around what this Arab awakening means for the future. Earlier today, we explored how the democratic process is unfolding in the emerging democracies of the region. We also looked at the U.S. role in the region. And this panel will explore the changing regional order arising from the revolutions taking place. It almost goes without saying that the Arab uprisings have reconfigured the region's formerly ossified political landscape in significant ways. Interstate relations, alliances, and traditional alignments have been deeply shaken by the tide of events. A lot of uncertainty about the future, and we will be exploring all that today. We see an increasingly assertive Turkey. We see an Israel that many would argue looks increasingly isolated, and in Iran, alarmed by events that perhaps pose a threat to its desire to be a regional hegemon, and even the GCC taking new action, which is always a surprise. We'll be touching on the meanings of these and other developments, and with this excellent group of panelists. Their extended bios are in the program book, so I'm just going to briefly introduce them. Paul Salem is the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, Lebanon, where he has joined us. He works and publishes on the regional and international relations of the Middle East. Jamal Khashoggi is a leading 24-hour Saudi-backed news channel called Al Arab, and previously served as editor-in-chief of the leading reformist paper in Saudi Arabia, Al Watan. And I believe he had the honor of being fired twice from it.
Yes. Why do you have to say that?
Shows.
And he's flown in from Riyadh. He's an old friend, so we can make these jokes. Abdelkhaleq Abdalla is a professor of political science at United Arab Emirates University and an expert on contemporary Arab and Gulf affairs. He's in from the UAE. Thank you so much for joining us.
He's never been fired, I think. No.
Lissa. It's coming up. Mohsen Milani is professor of politics and chair of the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of South Florida, and is currently writing a book about Iran's regional policies. And last but not least, Haim Malka is Deputy Director and Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His areas of expertise include the Arab-Israeli conflict, North Africa, and political Islam. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have limited time, so we'll just get started, and we'll begin with you, Paul.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks to the Middle East Institute for this impressive and large gathering on such an important topic. To talk about the impact of the Arab Spring on the Middle East order and Middle East dynamics, one must start with the realization that there really was no regional order. It's a very disordered region. There's a Middle East disorder. It is one of the most disordered sub-regions or regions in the world. The Arab world was already divided between sort of the so-called moderates and the rejectionist states, long-standing Arab-Israeli conflict, a newer Arab-Iranian conflict, Israeli-Iranian conflict, U.S. occupation or armed presence in Iraq, U.S. tension, conflict with Iran, ongoing war on terror. So this was not a region which was going nicely, and now events are unsettling it. It was a region in search of an order, but had not arrived at it. It was a region, however, where there were spheres of influence. That's certainly the case. Saudi Arabia, sort of through the GCC, had a certain sphere of influence. It also projected power through its finances and its media and elsewhere throughout the Arab world. Iran obviously had a strong ally in Syria, and through Syria influence with Hezbollah, and for a while Hamas. And after the removal of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, a lot of influence in Iraq. So certainly an Iranian sphere of influence. a huge US sphere of influence through its armed presence in Iraq and the Gulf and its alliances from North Africa through the Arabian Peninsula. Turkey was an emerging power, building soft power through trade, economics, and diplomacy. So there was sort of a map of the relationship. The impact of the Arab Spring, of course, it's an ongoing dynamic. We might come to different conclusions in 6 months or 12 months from now, but some early observations. One is the power shift that is being brought about by the Arab Spring is a power shift towards the people themselves, and it's a very significant power shift. So on the face of it, the impact that has on external influence in the Middle East is negative in the sense that there's a net gain over regimes by the people, and therefore, in a sense, a net loss by external powers. Somebody like President Mubarak, who was not very beholden to domestic politics, was more dependent on external support and hence more amenable to external influence. Somebody like Bashar al-Assad, who does not have tremendous domestic support, is more amenable to Iranian dependence and Iranian influence. So perhaps one effect of the Arab Spring is more Arab politics, a more national political process. There's been no dramatic shift in the balance of power. There's been dramatic events, but no dramatic shift in the balance of power. This is perhaps surprising. In past coups d'etats and revolutions, there were immediate impacts on regional and international relations. The '79 revolution in Iran, of course, shifted Iran from one alliance to another. The Free Officers' coup in Egypt in '52 quite quickly shifted Egypt from one camp to another. This has not happened. So there has not been a dramatic change to the relations and the balance of power yet in this period. However, all the players definitely have been significantly affected. The US initially perhaps panicked, expecting that these revolutions would replay something like the Iranian Revolution, that perhaps the fall of a Mubarak would mean a very anti-American outcome. It turned out not to be the case. These revolutions focused on domestic issues. They did not focus on foreign policy issues. And the governments that either are coming or will be coming to power do not clearly carry a strong foreign policy shift and have a lot of interest at stake in economic cooperation and security cooperation. So the US, initially expecting possibly to lose a lot, has ended up not losing all that much. It lost a number of friends, Mr. Mubarak, Mr. Ben Ali, and others, but it still maintains the same basic set of relationships, perhaps some gain even in Libya. Iran, to the reverse, initially very hopeful, very optimistic that finally these revolutions would bring about change, that this would be change similar to the change they brought about in 1979, not realizing that the Arab revolutions were more like 2009 than 1979. So Iran initially hopeful, but quickly quite disturbed and alarmed by what was going on. Iran has lost enormous soft power and popularity in the last 10 months for two clear reasons. One is that the Arab public that was protesting against their own dictators associated how the Iranians dealt with their own protesters in '09 to what their own dictators did, and put the Iranian regime in the image of a familiar dictatorship, oppressing its youth and its people. Secondly, Iranian support for the Assad regime in Syria, while that regime killed and tortured and jailed tens of thousands, was maybe the nail in the coffin of that popularity. Opinion polls put Iranian popularity before the last 2 years around 80%. Recent polls put it around 15%. Turkey initially stumbled in the Arab Spring. Turkey had obviously the well-known policy of zero problems, and it also had very significant economic investments and an interest in some key countries like Libya. The zero problems policy didn't make any sense anymore when within the same country there was a government and a people taking different positions. But perhaps more importantly, Turkey's immediate business interests in Libya, for example, and in Syria clashed with some of its political principles and it had to make a decision. After the initial stumbling, I think the AKP party has quickly tried to take the lead to get ahead of this movement. It has the credibility to do so, unlike Saudi Arabia or Iran or the US or anybody else, because it has a political system which is recognized by many players in the Arab uprisings as possibly an example, possibly something that could be emulated. So it could try to play on that dynamic, and the Prime Minister certainly has gone around touring the region to emphasize that. Turkey has a particular influence in Syria and might have a particularly strong influence in Syria if things move forward, and I'll say a few words about that in a moment. Israel, perhaps from the beginning, perceived itself to be a loser, and indeed was further isolated. It had lost Iran in '79, it lost Turkey in a year or two before the Arab Spring. It lost President Mubarak, who was a particularly strong friend and ally. And by losing Mubarak, it in effect loses King Abdalla of Jordan as well. He cannot stand alone. So Israel certainly finds itself further isolated than it was before, even though the Egyptian position is somewhere in the middle, keeping the peace treaty, but no longer the warmth and close cooperation that existed under Mubarak. Egypt is slightly re-emerging as a soft power in the Arab world. Certainly, the Egyptian example has become very popular in the Arab world. So as a narrative, the Egyptian narrative, Tahrir Square, is dominant. Whether Egypt and any new leadership in Egypt, as was mentioned in the morning, a new president, a new government in Egypt, whether they can parlay that into more soft power and diplomatic and political influence in the region has yet to be seen. But already the activism of the Arab League, for which Egypt is partly responsible, indicates a resurgent Egypt. Qatar, certainly a key player in the uprisings through Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is responsible for a lot of the wave element. That's something that happened in Tunisia, arrived through media to Egypt, and then from Tahrir Square was broadcast in very moving tones throughout the Arab world. Al Jazeera was a key player in that, and Qatari diplomacy now through the Arab League and invigorating the Arab League after decades of ossification is a very dynamic and a very interesting role. Saudi Arabia, maybe like everybody else, was certainly taken aback by the Arab Spring and had very serious concerns about its very nature. Other than losing friends like Mubarak and Ben Ali and others, popular demands or demands for political participation and so on alarmed Saudi Arabia to a great degree, and were brought home in a specific way in the case of Bahrain. Saudi Arabia and the GCC have reacted strongly there, in a sense consolidating the power of the GCC, but still not resolving sort of the question that with the Arab Spring and with history moving in this direction in the Arab world, and Saudi citizens are like Egyptian citizens, like everybody else, subject to the same ideas, Saudi Arabia still seems to not have made its decision as to which side of history to be on. It's just had a very firm response. So everybody's been affected, but no complete dramatic change yet. Syria could be the game changer for this. Syria is the only major country where a change of regime might indeed bring about a complete change in regional and international alignments. That cannot be said for Tunisia or Egypt or even Yemen. The uprising in Syria, as we've all been following, yes, it's limited. It's perhaps not all the cities and all the population, but it is very significant. It's in over 200 towns, villages, and areas. It's persistent. It's several million strong. It will not retreat. It will not bend. The regime, at the same time, has hung tough. It has not collapsed like other regimes that have been challenged. Perhaps partly because of the backing of the Alawi community, many of which see this as a make or break battle. So the regime is hanging tough, but it is crippled. It is not able to prevail. It is unwilling to negotiate, or perhaps more dangerously, it's unable to negotiate. Because any negotiation, as we also were discussing on the Israeli-Palestinian track earlier, requires sacrifice. And I don't think the Syrian president is able to make sacrifices within his regime. His father may have been able to. I don't think he is able to. The economy in Syria is bad and getting worse, but it is not on the brink of collapse. Syria is somewhat isolated economically, but not completely. It's open to trade with Iraq, with Iran, and with Turkey, and with Lebanon, and with other countries.
And with the Gulf.
And GCC and the Gulf. Regional and Western positions on Syria have changed dramatically from the early summer to the early fall, culminating recently in the expulsion of Syria from the Arab League, a controversial but very firm and very important move. I think that is a very serious turning point for the crisis in Syria. It has, and we will probably see repercussions in the weeks and months ahead. The Syrian National Council, or the Syrian opposition, which initially had trouble getting united and getting recognized, is finally gaining traction in the Syrian National Council, and they might begin to gain recognition from the Arab League and other locations. I think Syria is still sort of waiting or needs a Benghazi moment, but I think the Arab League is setting the stage for such a moment and setting the diplomatic stage to take action if that takes place. A post-Assad Syria would have a strong Sunni majority leadership in it. It will probably align its foreign policy closer to Turkey and maybe the GCC. It will maintain relations with Iran, but it will most likely not be in a deep alliance or deep dependency or client relationship. Such a change in Damascus would be possibly the biggest blow to Iranian regional power since the challenge of the Iran-Iraq war, and might indicate the end of an arc of ascendancy from 2003 till 2010, which Iran has been riding with the removal of the Taliban, removal of Saddam, high oil prices. Hezbollah does well in 2006. This might be the beginning of a new period. A change in Damascus would also leave Hezbollah strategically very vulnerable. This strategic vulnerability could either end in another war between Israel and Hezbollah, or could open up, the context of a post-Assad Syria could open up the possibility in a few years of Syrian-Israeli peace talks, which would be another way to deal not only with the Golan, but with the issue of Hezbollah. Finally, what could the new Middle East look like? The new Middle East with some of these transitions moving forward, and perhaps with a post-Assad Syria. I think it would be, we would see first a more consolidated Arab bloc that now includes Syria, but still excludes Iraq, with cooperation between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the Arab League, and the GCC. I think we will see, and we're already seeing, larger institutional roles for the GCC, whether in its own region or reaching out to Jordan and Morocco, and a bigger role for the Arab League with a resurgent Egypt and supportive Gulf. I think it'll be a region with more limited influence in Iran, for Iran. Iran might have to retrench to focusing on Iraq in the region, but might lose Syria and Lebanon. But it will still be a region with an ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict, with an ongoing Arab-Iranian conflict, with an ongoing Israeli-American-Iranian conflict. There will be continued strategic influence for the US, the deployments and the alliances. The US is still the main strategic provider in the region. Other emerging powers cannot provide that. But there will be bigger economic roles for the other emerging powers, including the EU, China, India, and Russia. The challenge remains, in closing, to build a stable regional order. This would involve consolidating Arab relations, not only by reintegrating Syria, but reintegrating Iraq as well, even with its new government. Secondly, building on Arab-Turkish relations, which are very ripe to move forward on all levels, economic, political, and strategic. Renew efforts, redouble efforts on the Israeli-Arab peace track. There could be an opportunity between Israel and Syria in a post-Assad Syria, and certainly keep trying on the Israeli-Palestinian track. Vis-a-vis Iran, contain and deter Iran, however, at the same time make clear that Iran has a place at the table of regional order as long as it moderates its policies and finds a way to deal with the nuclear issue. In the Arab Spring, the Arab publics demanded human security, prosperity, and good governance. I think for the region, one can also hope for a secure region, a prosperous region, and one which is regionally better governed than through repeated military deployments and conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Jamal.
All right. Thank you very much.